Hey guys, Sasa here with a new type of video that I will be trying out on my channel. The King of the Hill challenge will showcase me competing in the daily events with 3 different decks. The first deck I am playing, Barbarians, might seem familiar. It is a rendition of the Barbarian deck that I played in an earlier deck tech. Literally, immediately after uploading that last video, I bought a booster pack and opened a Crusher. So I replaced the Yorn showcased in the last deck tech with the Crusher, and one of the Rooks with the John for economy. It plays exactly like the last Barbarian deck, but now I am able to win the game without the need to shut my opponents out of the game. Looking at the game itself, my opponent manages to score a successful gamble. My health doesn't really matter in this matchup, since if my opponent is able to consistently overpower me, I lose the game regardless of what my health total is currently at. My opponent, playing Trolls as evidenced by his Vago, is favored to win the matchup since I rely on wound effects to disrupt my opponent, and his Tribal Hex ability is capable of dealing 35 damage in a single turn. My game plan is to simply be annoying with wound effects and whittle at his health with 5 Barbarians. I set up Fog to abuse his snipe ability for the majority of the game, and force my opponent to set up a defensive unit if he ever wishes to block the snipe. I spend this turn setting up the Fog and Crusher combo, which is capable of winning the game by itself. My opponent has the forethought to block the snipe with his Grom, and has his Pain wound my Driaga. My deck lacks healing units, so every time a unit is wounded I have to sell it, putting me back in tempo. Despite a successful gamble on my opponent's part, I still win the combat phase and whittle at my opponent's health. Purchasing a rune, I try to be cheeky with the surprise knockouts. My plan fails, but my opponent reveals his commander, which is just a giant ball of stats. The ball of stats still manages to deal enough damage to win the combat phase, and my city sustains minor damage. I shuffle around a few of my units, and actually manage to score a successful knockout on my opponent's commander. In Highgrounds, every time your commander is removed from the field in any way except for transform, your city sustains 2 damage. Having both severely overpowered my opponent and knocking out his commander, my opponent concedes the game. In the second game, I chose to run a basic aggro decks. Aggro decks are inherently weak in Highgrounds due to the handicap system, which my opponent has the benefit of having, and due to the way the combat phase is handled in Highgrounds compared to other popular CCGs. Since you only deal damage if your attack is higher than your opponent's, aggro decks basically automatically lose the game if the game happens to go on for too long. My first turn was above average since I was capable of dealing 2 damage to my opponent's city. The best opening for an aggro deck consists of 2 Roas and a Root, which deals 8 attack on turn 1 and can clock your opponents for 3 damage. On my second turn, the purchase of a second Knight and a second Roa lead to me dealing 3 damage to my opponent's city. You might see an odd choice in this hand, a Drummond. Every aggro deck in Highgrounds needs to have some form of late game insurance if the game happens to go on for too long and your opponent is capable of out-damaging you. Popular choices are Drummond, Flip, or Fog to either deal a high amount of damage in a single turn or wound an enemy's units before it can act. My opponent reveals his commander, who is a massive ball of stats akin to my last opponent's. I am not at all favored to win this game, since it takes 4 units between 2 Rams and 2 Williams just to match the attack of a single unit. I have to shut down my opponent's commander if I want to have any chance in winning this game, so I sell a William in order to afford a Drummond. While I do wound the commander, my opponent reveals that he is playing a second massive ball of stats in Oakley. I should be fine if I manage to wound the Oakley before it connects. My opponent, who has failed to shuffle his units at all during this game, should be simple to predict for successful Drummonds. Unfortunately for me, my opponent reveals that in his gold mid-range deck, he is playing a copy of Julian, so it is now impossible for me to win this game. Still determined to cheese out 6 more damage, I sell my final William to afford a Drummond so that I can target the Oakley. Of course, my opponent runs a second Oakley in his deck, so my actions are fortuitous. Since my opponent can now overpower me regardless of what I currently play on the front row, I decide to push my units back to gather some minor resources for one final push. My opponent, unchallenged on the front row, deals significant damage to my city. I gather a few more units for my final push. Alas, my final push is for naught, as my opponent manages to deal the last bit of damage to my city, leaving me with a score of 1-1 as I head into my third and final game. In the third match of the day, I am playing Albatross, one of my favorite decks in Highgrounds and the first competitive deck I built when I started playing the game. My opponent opens up with a front row John on the first turn. John, an economy unit, should never be placed on the front row. Even in aggressive decks, which my opponent is playing, turn 1 economy almost always trumps turn 1 deal 1 damage to your opponent's city, so I surpass my opponent in tempo on the very first turn. On the second turn, my opponent reveals his commander, who, when combined with John, managed to deal 2 damage to my city. Even though I had an awful start in a forest deck economy-wise, I am still miles above my opponent in tempo. Since the clock that my opponent has set is trivial, I don't bother setting my opponent's back in tempo with the fireball from my mag. My opponent skips his turn 3, and I can safely spend a turn gathering even more economy. Sadly, I drew my commander on turn 4. I had a 44% chance of playing my commander before my next reshuffle, but since my opponent's clock is trivial, I am not too concerned. I have enough economy units to afford my commander if I only sell a single Onzel. On turn 5, which is the turn most aggro decks try to win the game, I managed to outdamage my opponent while I am still at a healthy 10 health. My opponent would still have a fighting chance had he placed John in the back row, especially since he skipped his turn 3 as an aggro deck. Likewise, since I have 4 recruits, 14 units in my deck, and 10 units on the field, I am guaranteed to draw Albatross next turn, and the game is all but over. I purchase Albatross and leave enough economy units active to purchase my final 2 units, Onzel and Marsh, next turn. My opponent skips his turn 6, and my Albatross and Mag rip my opponent's army apart. My opponent concedes before the next turn starts, but there are still lessons to be learned from the match. As I've said numerous times before, don't have an arbitrarily large amount of units in your deck as it makes your draws inconsistent. My opponent, an aggro deck, managed to skip 2 turns which wouldn't be possible if he had a low curve and a small army. Likewise, tempo and high grounds matters a lot. Since my opponent plays his economy units on the front row on turn 1 and kept them there for the entire game, I was given free reign to do literally whatever I wanted. A bad turn 4 draw, which is usually crippling against the most efficient aggro decks, went unpunished since my opponent was too slow. If you enjoyed this game and would like to play it for yourself, you may do so by following the link in the description. Highgrounds is a free-to-play browser game that is easy to get into due to its low learning curve and daily free units. If you enjoyed this content, feel free to check out my channel. Until next time, have a good day.